Postmodernism, yes, I still really don't understand what postmodernism is. I've been told many times, and it's been explained to me many times, and I still am bewildered. But perhaps that's part of the movement, bewilderment.
I don't think I really know too much about what postmodernism actually is. For me, it's primarily an architectural movement.
Postmodernism was a kind of style, and it was a kind of outrageous style at that.
I think we're originals, that it wasn't until I got spoken to by the V&A that I thought about anything that was postmodern.
The way I worked, I described as retrievalism.
The Independent said, do use the word postmodernism because it means absolutely nothing and everything.
I called myself a new futurist for a while. So, yeah, that's a term I would use rather than postmodernist.
Well, I suppose I'd had a very postmodernist occurrence. I took acid. Normal things suddenly turned into something extraordinary.
Well, in 1977, punk was just starting to happen, and I thought, why not do tears that actually look like tears, and then got safety pins and beaded around them, like 12 years before Versace.
I had access to the first photocopier. I was able to modify and change the look of the image using a photocopier.
And of course, in the 70s and into the 80s, the record cover was this incredibly important, vital kind of medium of visual information. There was the music papers, and occasionally, the Sunday Times color supplement might just sort of, do something about Andy Warhol in New York, and that would be about it.
In the 70s, when I first started designing, there was a sort of a predominance of the international style, where the ultimate goal was to be clean. And I always felt that that was like trying to clean up your room. So I was looking for ways of designing typography that could be more expressive, that were not about creating order, but were about creating spirit.
Times Square was where we were in charge, but the whole revitalization of Times Square is a very interesting, complicated story, but it does show the difference between the modernist point of view of how to redevelop or to develop a city and what we were able to do working with Tibor Kalman.
Postmodern architecture is really to do with pluralism, and you'll find its depth. All of the great postmodernisms of philosophy and now in literature is about pluralism, pluralism, pluralism.
To say, no, it's a mess. In fact, we want to make it more of a mess. The world comes to Times Square not for tidykins, but for mess.
It's accepting that the modern world, with Freud, Marx, Henry Ford, mass production, was positive, but it can be radically improved.
We studied the signage in Times Square, and then we set minimums. Minimums for sizes of signs, minimums for brightness of signs. What we were legislating, in a way, was the capitalist impulse. Once you tell an entrepreneur that his or her sign can only be this big, he will be satisfied, he will agree to it. But if you say it can be this big, or bigger, or brighter, well, everybody wants to compete in a capitalist society.
So you have to be, on the one hand, ironic about the failures, probably the beginning of a new depression, another crisis of modernism, modernization, modernity. What's going to get us out of this? We have to rethink the modern movements in all the arts and in society, and postmodernism is the umbrella term for rethinking.
We knew 42nd Street was an incredible success when the Consolidated Edison Company called the state of New York and said, our grid is tapped out.
Here we go.
In the case of particularly Joy Division and then New Order, they could never exactly agree amongst themselves. There was no hierarchical structure, particularly in New Order, after the end of Joy Division, after Ian Curtis had died. The responsibility for the covers came to me, and so they were about what I was interested in, and they were about, in a way, beginning to learn the canon.
The thing that I was doing was I was using slip casting, and a lot of the sort of Leech tradition and kind of minimalist things also had that idea of sort of expressing the deep inner mystic qualities of clay. And I thought that was a load of complete rubbish. And I thought what was wonderful about clay was the fact that you could make it look like anything else.
They decided to call their first album Movement. The kind of sequences and the sort of a kind of a pulse beat. There was a subtle transition from Joy Division to New Order, and they had to find who they could be without Ian's writing and without Ian singing. The pulse beat begins to become what New Order are about. I was quite happy to show New Order futurism, because I was certain that Marinetti would have loved New Order.
Charles Jencks wrote this extraordinarily resonant sentence in Postmodernism, in which he said that modernism died in 1972 when Prior Ergo was blown up.
In fact, it goes back to the 60s, really, in a radical way. Feminism, black power, a whole series of groupuscules all over the world.
I think it was a release from constraint, from the design codes, the design rules, the functionalism of the modern era.
The notion of a singular aesthetic is untenable, is entirely unrealistic in the kind of democratized society.
And as such, it was a Pandora's box. The genie was out, and so it's about color and ornament and try anything.
If you take the actual broader philosophical meaning of postmodernism, there are no absolutes in art, whether it's architecture, painting, music, literature, or whatever.
It's a shift that brought the internet, the web. Things were never the same again.
During the kind of this high moments of modernism, the constructivist period, artists like Varvara Stepanova and her colleagues, Rodchenko, these kind of the productivists, they were designing the way that they imagined the proletariat, newly empowered and politicized proletariat, would dress. And the interesting question might be, what's the difference between an Issey Miyake or Comme des Garçons iteration of modernism? Can you imagine that garment in relation to a political revolution? Probably not. No, you can imagine it as a kind of citation. And if there is a thing called postmodernism, it's the absence of that thought. Can you imagine the Comme des Garçons worker? If the answer is no, then you're in the world of postmodernity.
When Ian died, the legend was sort of forged almost overnight. The message of this story was more profound than any broadcast or marketing could ever be.
One of the things that's particular about the English tradition is that it's very impure. yeah, we had an empire, we were forever nicking ideas from other places and kind of collaging them together. And
so you could have a piece of London that's pre-fire of London that happens to have survived, right next to something that came in as a Christopher Wren development, something that came through the railway age, a cottage that's hung on until it's wiped out to put out a Westfield shopping mall, and all of these things coexist.
So that combination of kind of complete a victory of the neoliberal economy, alongside the diversity of culture, diversity of interests, I think makes it a place where things happen in a postmodern way.
And it all meshes on somewhere like the Thames. The reason for London's foundation, that we come ashore from elsewhere and we reinvent ourselves by bringing people in that keep the culture alive.